So the war started. What was Putin's intention in the war? I can tell you what his intention was. It was to force Zelensky to negotiate neutrality. And that happened within 7 days of the start of the invasion. You should understand this, not the propaganda that's written about this. Oh, that they failed and he was going to take over Ukraine. Come on, ladies and gentlemen, understand something basic. The idea was to keep NATO, and what is NATO? It's the United States, off of Russia's border. No more, no less. I should add one very important point. Why are they so interested? First, because if China or Russia decided to have a military base on the Rio Grande or in the Canadian border, not only would the United States freak out, we'd have war within about 10 minutes, but because the United States unilaterally abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002 and ended the nuclear arms control framework by doing so. When Zelensky said in 7 days, let's negotiate, I know the details of this exquisitely because I've talked to all the parties in detail. A couple of weeks, there was a document exchanged that President Putin had approved, that Lavrov had presented, that was being managed by the Turkish mediators. I flew to Ankara to listen in detail to what the mediators were doing. Ukraine walked away unilaterally from a near agreement. Why? Because the United States told them to. Because the UK added icing to the cake by having Bojo go in early April to Ukraine and explain. And he has recently, and if your security is in the hands of Boris Johnson, God help us all. Keith Starmer turns out to be even worse. It's unimaginable, but it is true. I wouldn't change one word from what we wrote then. Nothing was wrong in that document. And since that document, since the U.S. talked the negotiators away from the table, about 1 million Ukrainians have died or been severely wounded. And the American senators, who are as nasty and cynical and corrupt as imaginable, say this is wonderful expenditure of our money because no Americans are dying. It's the pure proxy war. One of our senators nearby me says this out loud. Mitt Romney says this out loud. It's best money America can spend. No Americans are dying. It's unreal. Boris Johnson has explained, and you can look it up on the website, that what's at stake here is Western hegemony, not Ukraine, Western hegemony. Michael and I met at the Vatican with a group in the spring of 2022, where we wrote a document explaining nothing good can come out of this war for Ukraine. Negotiate now, because anything that takes time will mean massive amounts of deaths, risk of nuclear escalation, and likely loss of the war. And this is extremely important to understand. The nuclear arms control framework is based on trying to block a first strike. The ABM treaty was a critical component of that. The U.S. unilaterally walked out of the ABM treaty in 2002. It blew a Russian gasket. So everything I've been describing is in the context of the destruction of the nuclear framework as well. And starting in 2010, the U.S. put in Aegis missile systems in Poland and then in Romania. And Russia doesn't like that. And one of the issues on the table in December and January, December 2021, January 2022, was, does the United States claim the right to put missile systems in Ukraine? And Blinken told Lavrov in January 2022, the United States reserves the right to put missile systems wherever it wants. That's your putative ally. And now let's put intermediate missile systems back in Germany. The United States walked out of the INF Treaty unilaterally in 2019. There is no nuclear arms framework right now. None. The United States came to the view, especially in 1990, 91, and then with the end of the Soviet Union, that the U.S. now ran the world, and that the U.S. did not have to heed anybody's views, red lines, concerns, security viewpoints, or any international obligations, or any UN framework. I'm sorry to put it so plainly, but I do want you to understand. When the Soviet Union ended in 1990, the view became even more exaggerated. And I can name chapter and verse, but the view was we run the show. Cheney, Wolfowitz, and many other names that you will have come to know literally believed this is now a U.S. world, and we will do as we want. We will clean up from the former Soviet Union. We will take out any remaining allies. Countries like Iraq, Syria, and so forth will go. And we've been experiencing this foreign policy for now essentially 33 years. I tried very hard in 1991 to get help for Gorbachev, who I think was the greatest statesman of our modern time. I recently read the archived memo of the National Security Council discussion of my proposal, how they completely dismissed it and laughed it off the table when I said that the United States should help the Soviet Union in financial stabilization and in making its reforms. And the memo documents, including some of my former colleagues at Harvard in particular, saying we will do the minimum that we will do to prevent disaster, but the minimum. It's not our job to help. Quite the contrary, it's not our interest. In my understanding of the events that have befallen Europe in many contexts, and I'll include not only the Ukraine crisis, but Serbia, 1999, the wars in the Middle East, including Iraq, Syria, the wars in Africa, including Sudan, Somalia, Libya. These are to a very significant extent that would surprise you, perhaps, and would be denounced about what I'm about to say. These are wars that the United States led and caused. And this has been true for more than 40 years now. What happened, more than 30 years, I should say, to be more precise. Europe has paid a heavy price for this because Europe has not had any foreign policy during this period that I can figure out. No voice, no unity, no clarity, no European interests, only American loyalty. Okay, I mention all of this because you need your own foreign policy. I issue a report, 2 reports each year, one the World Happiness Report, and 18 of the top 20 countries, if I remember correctly, are European. This is the highest quality of life in the whole world. So you need your own policy to protect that quality of life. The United States ranks way down. And the other report, where's my colleague Guillaume? He's somewhere in the room. Here, there he is. Guillaume Lafortune is the lead author of our annual Sustainable Development Report. And almost all of the top 20 countries are European countries because you believe in this stuff. And that's why you're the happiest, except in geopolitics, but quality of life. So you need your own foreign policy, but you won't have it unless you have your own security. You just won't. And so, and by the way, 27 countries cannot each have their own foreign policy. This is a problem. You need a European foreign policy and a European security structure. And by the way, although Michael assures me it's dead, I was the greatest fan of OSCE and believe that OSCE is the proper framework for European security. It could really work. So this is really my point. Now, I believe that Europe should become more integrated and more unified in the years ahead. I'm a strong believer in subsidiarity. So we were discussing, I don't think housing policy is really Europe's main issue. I think this can be handled at the local level or at the national level. I don't see it as a European issue, but I don't see foreign policy as being a 27 country issue. I see it being as a European issue. And I see security being at a European level. So I think things need to be readjusted, but I'd like to see more Europe for truly European issues and maybe less Europe for things that are properly subsidiary to Europe at the national and the local level. And I hope that such an evolution can take place. So no, I don't believe in the collective West. I don't believe in the global South. I don't believe in, all these geographies don't even make sense because I'm actually, I look at maps a lot and the global South is mostly in the North, and the West is not even West. And so I don't even understand what this is about. I do believe that we could be in a true age of abundance if we got our heads on straight. We're in the biggest technological advance in human history. It's truly amazing what can be done right now. I marvel at the fact that somebody who knows no chemistry won the Nobel Peace Prize for chemistry because he's very good at deep neural networks, a genius, Demis Hassabis. They figured out protein folding that generations of biochemists spent their whole lives on. And now DeepMind figured out how to do it, by the thousands of proteins. We have friends that spent their entire life on one protein, brilliant friends. And now what we can do. I don't believe there is a collective West. I believe that there is a United States and Europe that are in some areas in parallel interests and in many areas not in parallel interest. I want Europe to lead sustainable development, climate transformation, global decency. I believe if the world looked more like Europe, it'd be a happier, more peaceful, safer world. And longevity and better food, by the way. But just saying, in any event, Europe has a vocation that is rather different from the American tradition and, frankly, from the Anglo-Saxon tradition, because it's been 200 years of Anglo-Saxon hegemony or aspirational hegemony. The British still believe they run the world. It's amazing what nostalgia means. They don't even stop. It's almost like a Monty Python skit, actually. But in any event, there were moments where there were disagreements and very, wonderful disagreements, especially in the last time of significance was 2003 in the Iraq War, when France and Germany said, we don't support the United States going around the UN Security Council for this war. That war, by the way, was directly concocted by Netanyahu and his colleagues in the U.S. Pentagon. I'm not saying that it was a link or mutuality. I'm saying it was a direct war. That was a war carried out for Israel. It was a war that Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith coordinated with Netanyahu. And that was the last time that Europe had a voice. So this was the mindset, and the decision was taken formally in 1994 when President Clinton signed off on NATO enlargement to the east. You will recall that in February 7th, 1991, Hans-Dietrich Genscher and James Baker III spoke with Gorbachev Genscher gave a press conference afterwards where he explained, NATO will not move eastward. We will not take advantage of the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. And understand that was in a juridical context, not a casual context. This was the end of World War II being negotiated for German reunification. And an agreement was made that NATO will not move 1 inch eastward. And it was explicit, and it is in countless documents. And just look up National Security Archive of George Washington University, and you can get dozens of documents. It's a website called What Gorbachev Heard About NATO. Take a look, because everything you're told by the U.S. is a lie about this. But the archives are perfectly clear. And I spoke with European leaders then, and they were very clear, and it was quite wonderful. Europe lost its voice entirely after that, but especially in 2008. Now, what happened after 1991 to get to 2008 is that the United States decided that unipolarity meant that NATO would enlarge somewhere from Brussels to Vladivostok, step by step. There would be no end to eastward enlargement of NATO. This would be the U.S. unipolar world. If you play the game of Risk as a child, like I did, this is the U.S. idea, to have the peace on every part of the board. Any place without a U.S. military base is an enemy, basically. Neutrality is a dirty word in the U.S. political lexicon, perhaps the dirtiest word. At least if you're an enemy, we know you're an enemy. If you are neutral, you're subversive, because then you're really against us, because you're not telling us. You're pretending to be neutral. Finally, let me just say, with respect to China, China is not an enemy. China is just a success story. That's why it is viewed by the United States as an enemy, because China is a bigger economy than the United States. You know, when the world talks about great powers right now, they talk about US, Russia, China. I include India, and I really want to include Europe, and I really want to include Africa as an African Union, and I want that to happen. But you'll notice on the list, Europe doesn't show up right now. And this is because there is no European foreign policy. So if actually, and same with renewable energy, as everybody knows, the prices come down by more than 2 orders of magnitude, the costs. We could transform the planet. We could protect the climate system. We could protect biodiversity. We could ensure every child gets a good education. We could do so many wonderful things right now. And so what do we need to do that? In my view, we need peace, most importantly. And my basic point is there are no deep reasons for conflict anywhere, as every conflict I study is just a mistake. It's not, we are not struggling for Lebensraum. That idea that came from Malthus and that became a Nazi idea was always a wrong idea. It was a mistake, a fundamental intellectual mistake. An intellectual mistake, by the way, because leading scientists adopted the idea that we had race wars, we had national wars, we had wars of survival because we don't have enough on the planet. As an economist, I can tell you, we have plenty on the planet for everybody's development. Plenty. We're not in a conflict with China. We're not in a conflict with Russia. If we calm down, if you ask about the long term is very good, thank you. The long term, if we don't blow ourselves up, is very good. And so this is what we should aim for. A positive shared vision under international law. Because of our technology, things operate at a regional scale now. It used to be, it was villages, then it was small areas, then it was unification of countries. Now it's regional. That's not just because regions are wonderful. It's because the underlying technological realities say Europe should be an integrated area. by transport, by fast rail, by digital, and so there's Europe. The politics follows the technological realities to a very important extent. We're in a world of regions now. On the Middle East, by the way, the U.S. completely handed over foreign policy to Netanyahu 30 years ago. The Israel lobby dominates American politics. Just have no doubt about it. I could explain for hours how it works. It's very dangerous. Europe has gone silent about the JCPOA and Iran. Netanyahu's greatest dream in life is a war between the United States and Iran. He's not given up, and it's not impossible that that would come also. And that's because the U.S. in this regard does not have an independent foreign policy. It is run by Israel. It's tragic. It's amazing, by the way. And it could end. Trump may say that he wants foreign policy back. Maybe. I'm hoping that it's the case. I'm hoping that Trump will not destroy his administration and worse, the Palestinian people because of Netanyahu, who I regard as a war criminal, properly indicted by the ICC, and that needs to be told no more, that there will be a state of Palestine on the borders of the 4th of June, 1967, according to international law, as the only way for peace. It's the only way for Europe to have peace on your borders with the Middle East, is the two-state solution. There is only one obstacle to it, by the way, and that is the veto of the United States in the UN Security Council. So if you want to have some influence, tell the United States, drop the veto. You are together with 180 countries in the world. The only ones that oppose a Palestinian state are the United States, Israel, Micronesia, Nauru, Palau, Papua New Guinea, Mr. Malay, and Paraguay. So this is a place where Europe could have a big influence. But the point I would really make is that Ukraine and Georgia were too far. This is right up against Russia. This is in the context of the complete destabilization of the nuclear framework. This is in the context of the U.S. putting in missile systems on Russia's borders. If you listen to President Putin over the years, probably the main thing, if you listen carefully, that he's concerned about is missiles 7 minutes from Moscow, is a decapitation strike. And this is very real. The U.S. not only would freak out, but did freak out when this happened in the Western Hemisphere. So it's the Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse. And fortunately, Nikita Khrushchev did not stand up and say, open door policy of the Warsaw Pact. We can go wherever we want. Cuba's asked us. It's none of America's business. What Khrushchev said is, war, my God, we don't want war. We end this crisis. We both pull back. That's what Khrushchev and Kennedy decided. So the most important thing is stop the yelling, stop the warmongering, and discuss with the Russian counterparts. And don't beg to be at the table with the United States. You don't need to be in the room with the United States. You're Europe. You should be in the room with Europe and Russia. If the United States wants to join, that's fine. But to beg, no. I have no doubt of why Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia wanted to join NATO. The question is, what is the U.S. doing to make peace? Because NATO is not a choice of Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, or Slovakia. NATO is a U.S.-led military alliance. And the question is, how are we going to establish peace in a reliable way? And by the way, Europe does not need to have Ukraine in the room when Europe talks with Russia. You have a lot of issues, direct issues. Don't hand over your foreign policy to anybody. Not to the United States, not to Ukraine, not to Israel. Keep a European foreign policy. This is the basic idea. If I were making those decisions back then, I would have ended NATO altogether in 1991. When those countries requested NATO, I would have explained to them what our Defense Secretary William Perry said, what our lead statesman George Kennan said, what our final ambassador to the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock, said. They said, well, we understand your feelings, but it's not a good idea because it could provoke a new Cold War with Russia. So that's how I would have answered it. When those countries joined in the first wave, I don't think it was that consequential, in fact, except that it was part of a bigger project. And the project was spelled out already in 1994. There's a very good book by Jonathan, Harvard University Press, called Hubris, which gives a detailed historical documentation of step by step what happened. And it's really worth reading. So this is the real consequential. Russia even swallowed with a lot of pain the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Slovenia. It is Ukraine and Georgia. And it's because of geography. It's because of Lord Palmerston. It's because of the First Crimean War. It's because of the missile systems that this is the essence of why there was this war. I'll just make a couple complaints. First, Europe is not NATO, as I said. I thought Stoltenberg was the worst, but I was wrong. It just keeps getting worse. Could someone in NATO stop talking, for God's sake, about more war? And could NATO stop speaking for Europe? And Europe stop thinking it's NATO? This is the first absolute point. Second, I'm sorry, but your high representative vice presidents need to become diplomats. Of course, you don't yet have a constitution for Europe which really underpins a European foreign policy. And it can't be by unanimity. There has to be a structure in which Europe can speak as Europe, even with some dissent, but with a European policy. I don't want to oversimplify how to get there exactly, but even with the structures you have, you could do a lot better with negotiating directly. The first rule is your diplomats should be diplomats, not secretaries of war. A diplomat is a very special kind of talent. A diplomat is trained to sit together with the other side and to listen, to shake hands, to smile, and to be pleasant. It's very hard. It's a skill. It's training. It's a profession. It's not a game. You need that kind of diplomacy. I'm sorry, we are not hearing anything like that. Diplomacy means going to Moscow, inviting your Russian counterpart here, discussing. This doesn't happen till now. Finlandization landed Finland #1 in the World Happiness Report year after year. Rich, successful, happy, and secure. That's pre-NATO. So Finlandization was a wonderful thing. #1 in the world. When Sweden and Finland and Austria were neutral. Bravo. Smart. When Ukraine was neutral, smart. If you have two superpowers, keep them apart a little bit. You don't have to be right with your nose up against each other, especially if one of them, the U.S., is pushing its nose into the other one. So Europe should be Europe with subsidiaries. Don't lose all of the wonderful, wonderful national and local elements. But Europe should be Europe. So the good side is I want Europe to have diplomacy, for example, with ASEAN. I spend a lot of time with the ASEAN countries. if the EU Green Deal, wonderful idea. I said many years ago, okay, to the ASEAN leaders, make an ASEAN Green Deal. And then talk with the Europeans so that you have this wonderful relationship, trade, investment, technology. So last year they announced an ASEAN Green Deal. What did Europe do about it? Nothing. It said, sorry, we're in the Ukraine war, thank you. No interest. So this is my point. The prospects are very positive if we construct the peace. And so Finlandization, to my mind, has a very positive connotation. So does Austrianization. Austria, in 1955, signed its neutrality. The Soviet army left. And Austria is a wonderful place, by the way. Absolutely wonderful. And so this is basic how to avoid conflict. If the United States had any sense at all, it would have left these countries as a neutral space in between the U.S. military and Russia. But that's where the U.S. lost it.